Hey Snappers, this is Bill Kinley, author of High School Runner, Freshman. Uh, Got a couple more stories that I've written about cross country, about my love of the sport that I wanted to share with you. The first one is about a guy that I coached 10, 15 years ago now. His name was Steve-O Grantenthaler. And I think coaching cross country and track, we don't make cuts. At least most don't, and we don't. And the thing is, some of the fondest memories, some of the best moments, they happen when they happen with guys that aren't in that top half of the race, or even in the top 99% of the race. And that was the case with Steve-O. You know how in any cross country race you're going to have about I don't know, 5, 6, 3 guys that are just way back there. And, when they come in, you get the little claps, get the nice little claps for them. And that's good. And that's well. But, Steve-O, man, he was an inspiration to us. I think that may be true for a lot of those guys that grind through it, and finish last or second to last. It's harder to run 22 minutes than it is to run 15 in some ways. I mean, some of those guys are working just as hard. In any case, this story is called Waz's Last Race, and it was inspired by Steve Grantenthaler, and I hope he hears it. Steve-O, when you hear this, let me know, man. This is for you, brother. Okay, here we go. Waz's Last Race by Bill Kinley, me. Jay Swift was the fastest high school miler in the state, with a 4:09 mile to his name. It was a matter of public record. Every week, the big city newspaper would print the best efforts of the season in each of the 16 standard track and field events, including relays. Reggie Wazkowski, while it wasn't a matter of public record, was quite possibly the slowest. He was exactly half a dozen minutes behind Swift, with a PR of 10:09. Swift was a lithe 6-footer who must have weighed in at 150 perfectly proportioned pounds. His talent was so profound that some said he might one day be the greatest high school runner ever. He looked like a Greek sculpture and had thick, dark hair that swooped down, Superman-like, in front of his blue eyes. Once, when he brushed it back with his perfect fingers just before the start of a race, I heard an older female teacher recruited as a timer whisper to another lady timer, "That is perfection." Wazkowski was maybe a 5-footer. He weighed about 75 pounds less than Swift, and was bald except for some colorless strands that stuck to the top of his head when he sweated. He sweated a lot. He claimed it was a side effect of all the medication. He looked like an old-school vampire, one from the Nosferatu camp, ancient and brittle. The whites of his eyes a spooky, disconcerting yellow. The cause of his jaundiced eyes was liver problems, also a result of all the medicine. Once, when Reggie Wazkowski waddled past a girl after finishing a race, I heard her whisper loudly to another girl, "That is so sad." Swift ran for the illustrious Ridgeline Salukis. Waz was a lowly Penns Gap snapper. You wouldn't think a race involving the two of them, a late-season dual meet after-school special, would produce much in the way of memorable results. You'd be wrong. Waz had a condition called achondroplasia. However, he wouldn't tell you that when you asked him what his physical deal was, which was a question he welcomed. He avoided the scientific jargon and bluntly claimed he was a dwarf. "Like Gimli," he would say in his high, nasally voice. "Thorin Oakenshield." If you stared at him blankly, he'd then say, "Lord of the Rings, don't you read? What's your problem, man?" He'd read all 3 books in the nearly 500,000-word trilogy, plus The Hobbit, multiple times. "Lots of bedtime," he would explain with a shrug. Although Waz's most obvious issue was his achondroplasia, it was just one of his many syndromes and conditions. That was why he carried an aluminum briefcase everywhere he went. Unlike the president, he said, he's got a briefcase he takes everywhere too. His is to blow up Russia if necessary. Mine's for keeping myself from blowing up when necessary. Waz's briefcase and the implications of it was the reason Coach wouldn't let him run. Well, at least at first, until he met Waz's mother. He could die at any second, shouted Coach. Waz's briefcase was open wide before him. It was full of syringes and pill bottles with prescription labels wrapped around them. So could you, said Waz's mom calmly. So could any of us. He's a senior. He's always wanted to be in a sport, but he's never been well enough. This is his last chance. You know what I mean, said Coach. He was pleading. Come on, look at all this stuff. If he fell over and stopped breathing, I wouldn't know which of those needles to stick him with. Yes, Coach, I know what you mean. But do you know what Brown versus Board of Education means? Do you know what separate but unequal means? No, said Coach, not really. Do you know what lawsuit means? Coach knew what that meant. Waz was officially on the team. For a while, Coach resented Waz because of his mother. However, by being the toughest, most disciplined athlete you've ever met, Waz soon became an obvious favorite of his. If you other guys would be more like Waz, we'd be a heck of a lot better, he'd bark out as we did our drills on the football field. Look at Waz, do it that way. This was because Waz listened hard, did exactly what Coach said, and pushed it on every workout. His seriousness of purpose as he counted out his push-ups in his high voice was infectious. His focus when doing Coach's prescribed cool-down to a T was contagious. His disease wasn't. He sometimes had to assure his opponents as they stared at him, a mixture of fear and sadness on their faces. It's a disorder, not a virus. You can't catch it, he'd say. It's genetic bad luck. One afternoon, Waz asked Coach if they could talk after practice. I watched, curious, from a distance. As Waz spoke, Coach stared down at him. His face was at first confused, then slightly annoyed. Then he shrugged and nodded. Waz stuck out his very small hand, and Coach stared down at it for a few beats before he reluctantly shook it. I waited until Waz was gone, then asked Coach what he'd said. If it was okay for me to know, of course. Coach was thoughtful. He considered things. I don't think he'd mind, he said quietly, his eyes off in the distance. He shook his head. He's something else. So what did he say? I pressed. Coach looked at me then. He asked me not to use him as an example anymore. He smiled a sort of sad, sort of admiring smile. He said he just wants to be one of the guys. That entire season, Waz lugged his briefcase around without a word of complaint. About halfway through, a big thrower, an overbearing senior named Hank Warner, picked it up from where it sat in the aisle as he made his way off the bus. This thing must be 40 pounds, he said. He began to carry it down the aisle. What are you doing? Asked Waz as he rose from his seat. There was a hint of confusion and a tiny tightening of the mouth on Warner's round, dark-bearded face that suggested anger. I'm going to carry it for you. That okay? It's mine, Waz said firmly. I carry it. Hank Warner shrugged his big thrower's shoulders. Okay, he said. He put it back down with a clunk. You carry it then. The bus was silent. All eyes were on Waz. Waz picked up his briefcase. Thanks anyway, he said. He tilted his head back and looked up into Hank's eyes. Look, I'm not trying to be a dick. I just can't let people treat me like I'm special. You got it, buddy, Warner said in a tone that was more than a little patronizing. He was still mad at having his good deed rejected. He then patted Waz roughly on top of his nearly bald head. It was as if his hand momentarily had a volition of its own. Somebody on the bus said, "Damn," and the rest of us got silent. Warner quickly pulled his hand back, as if he'd touched a hot stovetop. His eyes widened in surprise at what he'd just done. He looked at Waz. I think we all expected Waz to go bonkers right then, for him to leash out with all that pent-up rage we felt must be in him. But he didn't. "It's okay," he said in a quiet, tight voice. He wasn't smiling. His yellow eyes twitched. "You can touch me. I won't break." That was kind of a big moment for Waz as far as the way the rest of the team saw him, the sprinters and jumpers and throwers, those that didn't see him busting it as hard as he could like us distance guys did every day. He'd faced Hank Warner, a big guy who had a reputation for being difficult, and made it through looking good. After that, he was just another guy on the team. Kind of. At the start of the 1,600-meter run that late spring day, Jay Swift was the third man out from the inside of the track. It's the best starting position there is when you're on an arc. Waz was in the worst starting position, the last man out on the arc, nearly off the track. He looked like an old man, possibly a demented escapee from a nursing home who'd nabbed a uniform and some spikes and slipped into the race in an attempt to relive a youthful moment. At the gun, the varsity pack tucked in behind Swift. The JV guys fell back quickly, and Waz fell way back to last place. Swift lapped Waz before he'd finished his first quarter. It was the earliest lapping I'd ever witnessed, and went on to run a seemingly effortless 4:16. It was impressive for sure, but it was when there was only a single lonely runner left on the track that I realized something truly special might be underway. "Is Waz running under 2:30 for his quarters?" I asked Coach. Coach checked his clipboard. "I'll be," he said quietly. "Would you look at that? 2:28 and 2:29. He looked at the watch on his wrist. "Right on for his third lap, 2:30 on the nose." "I'll be," he said again. "He's 3 seconds under." He glanced around the track. "Where's Hank?" "At the shot put," I replied. "Duh, he's a shot putter." Coach glanced toward the shot put. "Watch your smart mouth and go get him." "Why?" "Just do it," he said. "Tell him to meet me at the 200 mark." "Hank," I said, just after the 12-pound metal ball he just putted thumped down in the dirt. Waz might break 10. Coach wants you there with 200 left." Warner picked up a dirty towel and rubbed his hands. He glared out across the track. "Let's do this, Waz," he growled. "Go tell the vaulters and the long jumpers," he told me. "I'll get the high jumpers." "You've got one more throw," said the official in his red jacket. "I scratched," said Hank. He glared at me. "Run, K1, now." As I sprinted toward the pits, I kept glancing over at Waz as he made his way down the backstretch. His legs looked like egg beaters. He was so bow-legged there was a wobbly, spinning motion to his gait. The torquing in his midsection due to the awkward tightness of his shoulders and hips was obvious, even a little painful to watch. Waz's body, as it had his whole life, was fighting him, but he was fighting back. There was a crowd waiting when I arrived at the 200-meter mark with 6 or 7 other guys, all of us breathless from our sprint across the field. And it wasn't just green and orange gathering. There was some maroon and silver in there as well. "That kid's gonna die," said Jay Swift. He dabbed his perfect forehead with a towel that hung around his perfect neck. He ambled over from the finish line and wasn't even breathing hard from his effort anymore. Coach glanced back. His eyes narrowed. His voice went low. "We're all gonna die, Swift, even you. It's how you run the race that matters." Swift's eyes went wide. He thought he was a special boy. He wasn't used to being talked to that way. "You gotta go, now!" yelled Hank as Waz wobbled past like a spinning top about to run out of spin. "You gotta kick!" As Waz made his way into the last turn, his face a rictus of pain and determination, runners and coaches from both teams charged across the football field and gathered on the home stretch. Some fans hopped the chain-link fence to get closer to the action. Without any direction from anyone, a sort of floating, skipping gauntlet formed. 2 long lines of screaming people leaning in, funneling Waz toward the finish line, urging him on. It felt like something out of The Lord of the Rings, a life-or-death trial. Waz came out of the turn and started down the final straight. "He's at 9:15, blared the announcer's voice above the track.
Come on, said Jay Swift quietly from beside me as Waz waddled past us. Then Swift started jogging and swinging his towel, first slowly, then faster. Go, man, go! He's not going to make it, I said as I jogged along beside Swift. He's going to fall over. Swift funneled his voice toward Waz through his cupped hands. Don't fall over, he shouted. But as we moved down the track beside him, it was clear Waz's equilibrium had gone a little haywire. He couldn't stay in a lane. Each of his legs seemed to want to cross over the other and send him crashing down in a heap. It didn't help that his eyes were squinted shut, his head tilted up towards the sky as he lurched from lane 1 to 4 and back to 2, blindly stumbling onward. Don't help him! Nobody touches him! Hank yelled, his arms stretched out as he jogged beside Waz, forming a barrier. He does this himself. 950, 951, 952, the announcer's metallic, echoey voice resounded over the field. Over the last 10 meters, Waz's head thrashed, his lips pulled back, revealing purple gums. There was a streak of white foam on his cheek. His jaw muscles spasmed, and I feared his teeth might crack, his heart might explode. He's gonna die, I said quietly. When he fell across the finish line, his eyes blasted open wide. It seemed as if he was peering up into the eyes of God. His hands clawed at the air, like he was either grabbing for the bottom of some cosmic rope ladder to heaven, or grasping for an immortal throat to strangle. He found neither and crashed down onto the track, skidded to a stop, then curled up like a dry, dead inchworm. All was eerily still then. Silently we stood, staring down at his motionless body. An ecstatic booming from the speakers far overhead broke the silence. 958! 958! The announcer shouted. He did it! He did it! The roar from all of us gathered around Waz at the finish line that day. It was more than a good-natured cheer. It was more than the polite, pitiful claps usually reserved for the last runner in any race. It was a triumphant howl. There was outrage in it, joyful defiance. We had just witnessed Waz give genetic bad luck the middle finger. It was a glorious vision to behold. Whenever I'm feeling like a victim, when I'm whining and thinking the world owes me something, I play it back and I remember. I remember a ridgeline runner jumping up and down, looking at nobody in particular, his hands balled up into fists. He was quietly saying the word yes over and over. I remember a woman in the stands wiping her eyes and laughing. I remember the announcer going crazy, like Waz had just set a world record. He did it! He did it! He kept shouting, his voice echoing out over the parked buses, over the roof of the high school, floating up into the empty sky. I remember Hank Warner leaning down and picking up the small, crumpled body of Reggie Waskowski from off the track. And I remember the sight of Reggie, so small in those big arms of Hank's, and how my breathing stopped. My heart shuddered at the realization that Waz was dead. But then, why was Hank grinning? Waz opened his yellow eyes as Hank lifted his 70-some pounds up and onto his shoulders. He blinked and glanced around as if confused. Then, when he realized what was happening, a not entirely pleased look spread across his face. He glared down at Warner. It was the same glare he gave him that day on the bus, the same look he gave all of us at one time or another, the one that said, just because I'm small, ugly, bald, and sick doesn't mean you're allowed to pity me. Relax, Reggie, shouted Coach, a huge grin on his face. He pointed at his stopwatch and gave him a thumbs up. Sub 10. Enjoy it. At that, a sheepish smile crept across Reggie Waskowski's pasty white face. He wiped a wispy strand of his silvery old man hair out of his eyes. Waz, 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 we shouted, about 150 of us, jumping up and down in a big, happy mob. That was when Waz gave in. He grinned and pumped his fist, and we erupted again in cheers at the awesomeness of the 9-minute and 58-second second performance we'd just witnessed. On that day, Woz did something he never got to do. From up on Hank's broad shoulders, he got to look down on us. And on that day, he got to literally experience what we figuratively did every day that season. He got to feel what it felt like when we looked up to him. On that day, the day he broke 10 minutes, Woz couldn't tell us not to treat him like he wasn't special. Because on that day, he was beyond special. On that day, he was the greatest high school runner ever.